What's going on, guys? My name is Chris. Welcome to Bourbinsane. Today we're going to be talking about bourbon. So I just wanted to do a quick video here kind of talking about what is bourbon and what qualifies bourbon to become the product it is. We'll go into the distillation process a little bit and talk about the steps bourbon has to take to become its final product. So first of all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. So there's 5 different rules that bourbon actually has to follow to be considered bourbon instead of some other form of whiskey. So rule number 1 is it must be made in the United States. A lot of people think it has to be made in Kentucky, which actually is not true. In order for it to be called a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, it does have to be made in Kentucky. But just to be considered bourbon, it can be made anywhere in the United States. Rule number 2, aging must happen in new, unused, charred oak barrels. And actually, for a bourbon to be considered straight, it has to be aged a minimum of 2 years. Just to be considered bourbon, it doesn't need to be aged 2 years. But to be considered straight bourbon, it does have to be aged at least a minimum of 2 years. Rule number 3, the bourbon must be at least 51% corn. So beyond that, they can add other grains such as wheat, barley, rye, even starting to do some oat whiskeys these days. But in order for it to be actually considered bourbon, it has to be 51% corn. Rule number 4, when they take the whiskey off the still, it can't enter the barrel at a proof higher than 125. Also, when they bottle the bourbon, it can't be bottled at lower than 80 proof. And finally, rule number 5, nothing extra can be added to the bourbon. So you can't put in colorings, flavorings. You can do that, but then it's going to be considered a flavored whiskey or some other type of whiskey. It's not going to be considered a bourbon at that point. Alright, so going into the distillation process a little bit, the first step in making bourbon is choosing which grain you're going to use. So as I mentioned, it has to be at least 51% corn, but then you have to make up your mind on if you want to use wheat, rye, oat, and barley. Typically the barley used in bourbon is actually just to get the yeast and the fermenting process going a little bit. It's usually not the main grain they will use. Scotch whiskeys typically use almost all barley when they're making their products. That's why you get totally different notes from Scotch to bourbon. Distillation is a process that separates liquids through differences in their first boiling points. So the still actually converts the liquids in the beer, they call it, into a vapor that travels into a condenser. This is where it then condenses back down into a liquid and concentrating the alcohol, so increasing that proof. When it is condensed back down, it's around 130 proof. The alcohol is pretty clean, but it still has a small amount of impurities. So typically it's going to be sent off for a second distillation process in what they call the doubler, and this actually removes any impurities you would see in the product. So the doubler is actually a pot-like still, which is what they used to always distill with back in the day. You can see it looks completely different than the column still we were just looking at. But this is where the alcohol is sent next for the second distillation process. The alcohol comes out of the doubler at around 140 proof. So pretty high there, and again, that wouldn't be considered bourbon at that point because it has to be put in the barrel at 125 proof or less. So after the second distillation process happens in that doubler, the alcohol is sent to holding tanks where it's checked for quality and consistency. At that point, the holding tanks would be emptied and the barrels would be filled to be aged. So depending on what the distiller wants, they can change the level of charredness on these barrels. So there's char levels between 1 and 4. 4 is actually called an alligator char, and it's when they set the barrel on fire for about 60 seconds. The higher the char, it's supposed to impart more of those burnt caramels, wood flavors into the bourbon. But you see how whiskey making companies could experiment with different char levels on their barrels to see if it imparts any different flavors into their bourbon. Now after the barrels are filled, they're going to be sent to the manufacturer's warehouses, which they call rick houses or rack houses, and this is where the bourbon's going to age. So who knows how long it might sit in the rick house. If it's an older, more aged bourbon, it could sit there 20-25 years. And that's going to be things like your Pappy Van Winkles. They have ranges between 10 years all the way up to a 23-year. Or it could be something that you maybe see in every liquor store you'd go into. It's going to be aged about 2 to 4 years typically. So after the bourbon barrels have aged for their set amount of time, they're pulled from the rick house and sent for bottling. Now depending on the type of bourbon they're making, several barrels could be combined, and that's called a small batch bourbon. So small batch is when they put together several different barrels of bourbon to get the taste profile they want. So small batch is considered anywhere between 1 and any amount of barrels put together. If they're making a single barrel bourbon, that single barrel is going to be used to make all the bottles from that barrel. With the single barrel bourbons, you may notice different tasting notes from one barrel to another. So even though they're aged in the same rick house, they may have been on different floors or different areas of the rick house. So if one part of the rickhouse was, say, a lot warmer than another part of the rickhouse, you'd expect to see totally different flavors between those two bourbons. Typically, after a bourbon is aged and those barrels are ready to be emptied and put into a bottle, it's watered down to the proof they want. So depending on what the master distiller is looking for, this could be anywhere between 80 proof and 160 proof. Several bourbons out there are labeled as barrel proof or full proof, so this means they don't add any water to their bourbon when they take it out of the barrels. What's in the barrel is the proof that they actually put in the bottle. And that's pretty cool because it imparts all the flavors you would get naturally from the wood. Sometimes adding water can change the taste profile completely on bourbon. So if it's taken directly out of the barrel with no water added to it, you're going to see a lot of full body, rich flavors in that bourbon. Some of the best bourbons and whiskeys I've ever tried have been straight from the barrel or full proof expressions. It gives you such a full, rich flavor and opens you up to a whole new world of tasting notes. Now, I know that was just a brief overview of what is bourbon and kind of the process it goes through to become its final product. But if you guys like these types of videos, please do let me know. I would love to do more informational videos. I definitely enjoy doing this kind of stuff, and if you guys want to see it, I'll definitely be putting it out for you. Thanks so much for joining me today, guys. Stay insane. Thanks for watching the video today, guys. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and hit that like button and that subscribe button. Also follow me on Instagram at Bourbinsane and Facebook Bourbinsane.